Welcome to Clinical Perspectives, the podcast where we explore the real challenges, insights, and decisions shaping the medical device industry. I'm Stephanie Stover, and each episode I speak with leaders, innovators, and experts across MedTech to uncover what actually drives product success, regulatory strategy, and commercial growth. If you work in the medical device industry, healthcare technology, or life sciences, this show is for you. Today I'm joined by Stan Glezer, Managing Director at Outcome Capital. Lovely to have you on the show today, Stan. How are you?
Great, thanks. Thanks for inviting me. Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So tell me the origin story of Outcome Capital.
So, Outcome Capital is an investment bank and strategic advisory firm specialized in human life sciences. It has been created about 15 years ago with a realization by the two founding partners that a traditional investment banking approach just does not work all that well in life sciences sector. And the reason for this is that transactions do not necessarily occur with the standard kind of, paradigm of get your product to the market, get, X amount of sales, positive cash flow, and then, we'll think about multiples or we'll do the IPO. A lot of transactions have tendency to happen in the earlier stages of development. And in order to understand what is the level of risk, what are the timelines, what's the potential for success, and what is the potential impact on valuations and return on investment, you actually need to understand the science. You actually need to understand the product development. You need to understand regulatory framework, IP framework, and so on. So you cannot be a generalist in this field if you want to succeed. So the premise of Outcome was to actually create an investment bank that, I keep on joking, doesn't hire investment bankers. The idea is to bring in industry professionals who have done product development and commercialization and have been both on the sell side and on buy side to actually provide first strategic advice in terms of defining the path to liquidity and then translate it into the transactions. So that's kind of where we started from. The company has been around for, as I said, about 15 years and very successful.
So what's your role in the company as Managing Director?
So as a managing director, I have kind of two main responsibilities. One is just bringing the business to the company. So I do interact with a lot of companies in Biopharma, in MedTech, looking at their profiles, looking at their investment thesis, and seeing if they would be a fit from the transactability and the valuation perspective. Oftentimes they actually don't fit the criteria, but I just give them advice and guidance anyway, because this business is not cross-sectional, it's longitudinal. Even if the company is not ready for the transaction today, they might be in half a year, in a year, in 2 years, and if I can be of help in the meantime, would be a pleasure. And then the other side of my responsibility is actually running the processes, doing the transactions, and ensuring that the customers who come into Outcome are successful in achieving their strategic objectives, whether this is fundraising, M&A, licensing, partnering, whatever that is. And obviously, I don't work alone when doing this. We have a pretty strong collegiality between the managing directors, and we're supported by a very strong and exciting team of people in the back office who do all the material preparation, valuation, modeling, targeting, and all of those things. So my role is to coordinate the work between those people to make sure that we have the best impact that we can deliver as a team.
Now, are you one of the people who advises potential clients?
Yes, absolutely. That's the primary aspect of the role. Because again, look, we are not McKinsey. We don't come in as advisors or consultants to just give the advice, right? We
Yeah.
do it with the very specific purpose in mind, which is defining the path to liquidity, looking at what the company has in terms of the technology, development plans, IP, commercialization, whatever that is, putting it in the comprehensive timeline where we can see where the value inflection points actually lie. And then if we know what the valuation might be at those points and when do they occur, we can then work backwards to today trying to figure out, okay, so this is what you need to get there in terms of time, people, competencies, expertise, and that's the level of risk that you'll have. That allows us to then think about the right partners to accompany the firm on this journey, whether those are investors, strategics, whatever that is. So my role is to actually work with the team internally and with the company's management and the board to actually align on that path to liquidity and translate it into the transaction strategy. So that's kind of one aspect of it. The other aspect of the strategy that we work on is how do you actually create the best environment for the company? And we're looking at the alignment between the sector dynamic, market dynamics, and the company itself, because, it's the triangulation of those things that makes things happen. But also we're trying to manage risk by creating optionality, by creating offensive position to the market, and making sure that when we assess the potential, we don't do it just based on the opinion, we also go out and we validate it. So we form opinion, we help with the strategy, but we also validate the strategy.
So what would you say is the most common gap that you find when working with your clients that they need to address before moving on to that next step?
Look, I mean, obviously, the companies that we deal with have been successful in many ways, and that's what makes them transactable. So they're run by very professional, very skilled people, and they have proven that they actually can get the traction. So that's all great. Where I think there is one of the significant gaps that I see often is that the company is not always well skilled in translating the operational work that they're doing into the actual value for the potential acquirer, right? Because when you talk to the investors, I see most of the decks that sound like I have a product or I have an idea or I have a technology. I need money. All right, show me one person who doesn't. The thing is, you have a conflict between the management who are very excited about their science, their tech, their operational performance, and so on, and the investor who has single-minded interest, which is rate of return. And this is where you have a disconnect. You have a pitch that focuses on the product while the investor is focusing on the return and, when is it going to happen and what's the risk level. Right? So it's this whole reframing that needs to happen. And oftentimes, unfortunately, the leadership teams or the boards are not quite skilled at doing this or might not be paying enough attention to this. The other thing that I would say is that when I'm looking at the opportunities, especially in MedTech, the first thing I look at is the clinical value proposition. Tell me, by the time you get to the market, why would your solution be disproportionately more beneficial to the patient in a given clinical situation as compared to anything else that's out there or will be there by the time you come out?
Mhm.
And if I don't get the answer to this question, then I'm not sure why would we even think about potential for the successful commercialization of this thing. I mean, you can still
Yes.
get it approved, but that's not it. So what we look at first clinical filter, then the technological feasibility, then the regulatory strategy, and then the commercial market access strategy and potential. But it's this foundational question of the clinical value that has to be answered. And unfortunately, I see a lot of medtech companies that do what they do, not because they have thought about utility, but because they know that they can technically do it. And that's a huge gap where you start with technology as opposed to starting with a patient.
So for companies who are maybe just starting out, what would be your advice to them um, before even starting the journey?
Right. So look, as usual, when you're doing the design and development, you need to think about the specs, right? What are you
Yeah.
designing towards? What I would advise is that before you start thinking about the specs from engineering perspective, think about the specs from a user perspective. Think about what is the clinical situation that your product will be used in and what is the problem that you're trying to solve in that situation. Because if you can answer this, then you can figure out, okay, so the form factor, the performance parameters, the usability, whatever that needs to be designed in order for this thing to succeed. Then you have the right design inputs. Oftentimes it's the other way around. What people say, okay, listen, we're going for 510K, here are my predicates, and therefore, this is their characteristics, this is what I need to match. And it just doesn't drive. I'll give you, an example of a device in respiratory field, which is helping patients with the positive pressure ventilation as they move. Great. I mean, it's really miniaturized. It's really well done. I cannot say, great idea. Problem is, it does require an oxygen tank to be attached to. So show me one person who will be walking around with this huge tank, despite the fact that your design is small, your device is small, but it kind of defeats the purpose of enabling mobility because of that, attachment that you haven't quite thought about. So what happens is this device, to my knowledge, has been sold 3 times already between different companies, none of them succeeding in commercialization.
So then, if we're thinking about it from a marketing perspective, how does what you're saying translate into marketing the product and just getting that return on investment?
Right. So look, if you are in marketing, what you're trying to articulate is the value that you're delivering to the customer, right? And in the medical field, that translates into one of the three value categories or the combination thereof, which is the
Yeah.
value to the patient, the value to the payer, and the value to the provider. So that's what I think the CEOs of the companies and their design teams have to think about. If you're designing it for the patient, obviously what you're looking at is, yes, the kind of objective clinical improvements, but you're also looking at the emotional side of things, right? I mean, your device can be the best medical technology ever, but if the user interface does look like, it came from the last century, it's probably not going to be as attractive as something that might be totally useless, but, very sleeky and nice and, and exciting to play with. So you need to think about both components of the usability and engagement, but also the component of the utility and clinical impact. If you're thinking about the payer world, you need to fit with the pricing, with the codes, with the reimbursement strategy, and you need to think about, your COGS. And COGS actually, I think, is one of the key design inputs, because then you can think about your margins and your negotiations and all of that stuff. And then the last but definitely not least by far, you need to think about the provider. How does it fit within the workflow? How does that help provider actually feel good and safe about what they're doing, that, there is nothing unforeseen that the patient will be taken care of? How does it fit with their workflow in terms of taking the patient in and following up? How does it fit with the EMR system and the billing? I mean, you need to think about how does it fit into that environment that it helps as opposed to adding additional tasks, right? And as I said, it's not just one aspect of it. You need to think about all three of them and how you maximize all three vectors from the get-go. Then your marketing becomes easy, right? But
Yeah.
the thing is, you need to think about it at the start when you're doing the design inputs, not at the the outcome level where we got the device. So okay, now let's try to figure out how do we sell it.
So in scenario when somebody has already built the product and now they're trying to go to market and perhaps they don't have that USP, what's your advice to them at that point?
So, look, I guess the question is you need to think about what your positioning is. Because, I mean, there are situations obviously when you already stuck, you inherited something and, it's there the way it is. And so you need to think about those vectors in the same way. How do you potentially win what's this game, whether this is pricing, whether this is targeting particular segments, whether this is different promotional materials, different type of engagement, so many commercial strategies that can be employed. But you also have to be prepared to say, you know what, I'm not sure that we're going to maximize the value. So the question becomes, okay, while we're trying to get traction, what would be the next thing that we can do, right? In terms of life cycle management, in terms of further differentiation, in terms of maybe either enhancing our portfolios with additional offerings while we're building that channel, or diversifying into additional channels or additional product offerings so that we can, kind of manage our risk, but also maybe build for the future a stronger foundation than what we got at this point. So it can be either let's just play with what we got and win if it's winnable, or how do we use it as a bridge towards a better strategy where we will have better chance to win.
How do you identify whether or not that a product is winnable or they need to go another strategy with another strategy?
Right. So, look, the mantra that we have at Outcome, and I think that that's true universally, is that the only party that is right is the market. You can dream up all kinds of strategies and all kinds of approaches sitting in the four walls and, bringing in great advisors. I mean, this is fantastic. But none of that stands if the reality that you're going to face is different. And we do operate in a very dynamic environment. What I often get scared by is people who say, well, I know this because I've been in this field 10 years ago very intensely. Not the same world anymore. I personally have worked with one of the companies that has introduced the product into the market just prior to COVID. They had very nice uptake, very successful early launch. Then COVID hit and they had to pull back because of the issues with accessing the hospitals and so on. And then they tried to relaunch. No traction whatsoever. And it's not because the product changed or the patients changed or the care changed. No, what changed is hospitals went into the austerity kind of mode of operation, trying to balance their budgets. And anything that is, even if it's a great product, but if it's not absolutely essential, just not going to get funded, right? So, and it's seemingly same idea. Why not just redo the same thing that worked a few years ago? No, it doesn't. And COVID obviously is a dramatic example, but there are a lot of shifts in the current environment in terms of the supply chain policies, COGS evolution, the behavior of the payers, behavior of the distributors, the shift in the way the government reimbursement works versus the private payers. I mean, you actually need to go out and do things. So with this, there is then the question of how do you make sure that you don't bankrupt yourself on the ideas that not going to work, right? And I think that an organization that is trying to just figure it out from the get-go has to have that iterative approach. Try a few things, try a few alternative scenarios, commit limited resources to them, but be in the learning mode. See what sticks, and then once you see that you're getting traction on that particular area, invest very heavily in there so that you can amplify the.
It's good advice. Talking about external factors, as a Canadian, I'm always interested to hear how the tariffs are impacting different different industries. How has that impacted your guys' company and your clients?
Yeah, and we're speaking literally in the same day when Supreme Court rendered a decision about tariffs, so I don't want to get political
Yeah.
here.
So this might not be relevant when this goes live, but I'm interested to hear your perspective.
There are a couple of areas that are probably worth highlighting. One is there is a very clear drive where tariffs is just one of the instruments, but there is a very clear drive in the US towards domestic sourcing and domestic manufacturing. Right. And that message has clearly shifted the mindset of a lot of manufacturing, especially larger manufacturing, in terms of how should they manage the supply chain and how should they manage their manufacturing capabilities. Because whether you like it or not, in terms of valuations, a lot of the companies are primarily valued on their US market activities and US market penetration. That's one thing. And so, from the supply chain perspective, although a lot of electronics and a lot of components used to come from overseas, now there is a clear conversation. Okay, you know what? Maybe we should make ourselves less dependent on the overseas and try to have either full sourcing from the US or have at least a dual sourcing strategy, which allows us to flex between different geographies and different suppliers. So I think that dual sourcing strategy became important. The other thing that happened is that from the perspective of the actual exit, as a smaller company, you typically exit to the larger company, right? It's a simple kind of, chain pyramid. The thing is the larger company in the position to do the acquisition. So
Cool.
what has happened with the larger companies is that on one hand, there is a pretty strong pressure on the prices and the margins with the push towards affordability and the cost management in the US healthcare. On the flip side, there is also that push towards manufacturing locally and, maybe getting the components, even if they're more expensive locally too. That puts you in a situation where you need to invest into the brick and mortar, the money that you were not necessarily planning to deploy. And if you put yourself in the situation of a strategic that has that pressure from the top line and squeezing the margins, plus the unforeseen expenses to develop new manufacturing in the US, which costs billions of dollars. It's not cheap, and that might not be producing anything for the next 2 to 5 years because of the licensing, certification, regulatory restrictions, and so on. Where would the cash come from? So what happens is the companies became much more reticent to do deals in the earlier stages and primarily are looking for something that they can just add to the bag. From the perspective of the large manufacturers, when you're being squished on the top line and your margins are being eroded, and you have that unforeseen expense in the capital expenditure line, you need to figure out what can you actually acquire, and how does it help you in a short and medium term? So therefore, a lot of companies shifted away from the deals in early stages of technology development into very late stages. Essentially, for most medtech transactions nowadays, happening only after the company has done a proof of commercial viability. So that put into a difficult situation companies that are in the earliest stages. And then those companies turned to venture capital, and venture capital had the same reaction, saying, well, I mean, if we're not going to exit those companies to the strategics, why would we invest into those? Right? Because the timeline became much longer and the risk became much higher. And so that almost froze the investment into the smaller size deals that are typically associated with VC financing of medtech. That had pretty dramatic effect on the industry last year, where a lot of companies kind of either suspended their development efforts or slowed down significantly. So that's kind of how that impacted the ecosystem.
Now, going back to what we were talking about with marketing and USPs, you mentioned that Outcome Capital's USP is that you're essentially an investment banking firm for life sciences, life sciences, medical devices, etc., who doesn't really employ investment bankers. Is that accurate?
That's correct. Yes.
So how do you communicate that to your target audience? And on what platforms, in what sense do you use that messaging?
Yeah, so that actually is one of the things that make my job easier, because when I'm talking to a person who is in biotech, and I used to work in biotech and I used to work in pharma, I mean, we speak the same language. Same happens when I'm talking to a medtech CEO, board member, or head of R&D. I mean, I used to run R&D, I used to run medical affairs, I used to do this work for a couple of pretty prominent medtech companies. So when they feel that they speak to somebody from their circle and we speak the same language, and I have expertise that's aligned or complementary to theirs, it makes the discussion so much easier. I mean, they actually see it as a breath of fresh air that they're talking to somebody who understands them, as opposed to, a person who just came to them with a spreadsheet. So that is easier. But at the same time, look, yes, I'm a physician. Yes, I have spent 30 years in the life sciences industry, but I'm also a licensed securities professional under FINRA. So I can't turn around and start talking the rates of returns and the capitalization and other things to the venture capital firms and to the private equity. So it being kind of fluid between those environments, that's what makes us unique, and that's what makes us efficient in our communication to those different audiences.
Mm. Here's a good question. If you had a magic wand that you could wave to solve any one problem within Outcome Capital's marketing, what would that be?
That's a loaded question, and I can tell you why. The business of strategic advisory and the business of investment banking is very heavily relationship-based business. This is not something where you can plug AI and, it's just going to spit out the whole target list and, send emails and then suddenly deals happen. The thing is, we do a lot of work in terms of meeting the clients, understanding the clients, and helping them navigate on a more personal kind of basis. And I
Yeah.
think what might be helpful from strictly marketing perspective is just helping with positioning or pre-positioning Outcome Capital to those who do not know us. The other thing is, when we interact with people, again, it's a longitudinal relationship. I think that from the maintenance, we do a lot of manual work. And if we could kind of have some sort of a signal of saying, well, I mean, the company is now getting to where it needs to be, so let's resume the conversation. Some automation in that area might be beneficial. I mean, we obviously track what's, the press releases, the news sent by the boards and the CEOs. We track the pitch book. I mean, we keep a pulse on it, but it's more manual than I would hope it would be.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And do you find that your clients have the same problem?
So the biggest problem of our clients, frankly, especially if you're talking about MedTech space, is very basic. It's funding. And there used to be a time where you could actually strategize around it, where you could say, okay, look, this is where we are. This is the profile of the investors. This is the type of the portfolio that they're managing. Let's talk to them because there is a reasonable probability of success. You reach out, you talk, and I mean, sometimes it works, sometimes it. There was some sense of logic and strategy to it. With the change that happened last year, whereas they were saying there was virtually no investment going on. People try those things, it doesn't work. They try different things, it doesn't work. So people lost sense as to what actually makes sense and what works. And it turned into the game of numbers. I mean, I talked to a number of CEOs who are telling me, listen, it takes 100 to 150 outreaches to the VCs to get one conversation.
Oh my goodness.
There's just no logic to it anymore. And what I would hope for my clients is that that situation changes, and not only they get traction, regardless of the traction, that they get some reasonable insight and understanding to better gear, to better target and better structure their.
So who would you say is the ideal client for you for Outcome Capital to work with?
So we operate within a certain transaction value range. On the minimum, we take $15 million transactions. On the maximum, about 350, 400. So we're mid-market player. So that's one. So we won't do the seed round of, first million for the company, but we're also not going to do, multi-billion dollar deals. The other thing is transactability. Come in when the company is ready to transact and it's desirable. We obviously will do assessment whether that desire is actually real, right? And whether there's an opportunity that matches it. But the transactability is a very important component. Now in MedTech, it does translate typically into, as I said, a company with a proof of commercial viability these days. It doesn't mean that they have to be EBITDA positive or cash flow positive. At least they need to have a number of accounts where they have orders and recurrent orders, and they have the understanding of the reimbursement or path to it. So it takes those parameters so that we can reasonably assess that they will have interest in the current environment. The other thing is that there are early stage companies that might potentially get traction, but those are these days mainly in the software as a service space, not in the hardware space.
Yeah.
And the last thing I would say, maybe on the polar opposite end of the spectrum, the companies that I try to stay away from are the companies who come to me saying, well, we have AI and it can do X. I'm sorry, AI in and of itself is not monetizable. Let's talk about what is the end product that the AI led you to, whether this is software or hardware or whatever, or the combination thereof. And how does that actually represent a competitive offering and differentiated offering to.
Love it. Let's dig into that a bit more. I'd love to talk a little bit more about your views on AI. So digging into that idea, if somebody does come to you and they have integrate AI into their product somehow, what are you looking for to determine whether or not it's going to be successful?
Okay, I think we might need a few hours. Maybe in terms of top line, I think that AI has a fantastic capability of connecting the different data points and finding patterns in large data sets, right? And that's what makes it trainable, and that's what allows you to very quickly come up with very insightful output from the system. So if you think about the data rich areas, those would be imaging, right? We have tons of images for pretty much any technology, anything you can come up with. We do have a lot of data on the labs. We do have a lot of data on the tissues and tissue biology, right? So those are the areas where training AI and having it as super helpful is pretty much a no-brainer. You have to go and do it. And if you're not doing it, you're probably going to be lacking behind everybody else who does it. Where we don't have the rich data sets is unfortunately in the area of clinical evidence, because clinical studies are by far inadequate in terms of the quality of the data and the external validity of the enrolled patient populations and the sheer number of the studies that have been conducted to train AI predictive models or generative models. The clinical data sets, unfortunately, are heavily concentrated in the hands of just a couple of the electronic health record providers, and there is no democratization of this access as we speak today. What I'm trying to say is that training AI on the clinical outcomes and therefore using it for translatability of those kind of inputs, whether those are labs or images or biomarkers, translating into the predictive clinical outcomes, I just don't see this as a play, at least in the near term. So when I'm looking at the companies who come up with AI, if they're coming in the area of digital pathology or image-guided therapy or any of those things, okay, that's great. Just let's talk about how does this thing perform and show me benchmarks, show me the clinical data. Okay, we're good to go. If somebody comes to me saying, we have a technology that's going to replace human clinical trials and move it into the realm of in silico clinical trials, I have fundamental questions as to how they thought this. Just on the basic, fundamental premises as what are we dealing with? And the problem is that you have to have certain ability of critical analysis of AI output because you have no transparency on the actual process of generating output. So you need to know what is your training database right for this purpose, and if the output makes intuitive sense based on the prior experience and expertise. And then those, as I said, in those areas that I have mentioned, it just doesn't make sense, and then some others it does.
Is there any other advice that you would like to leave our listeners with?
So, look, I definitely don't have as much wisdom as the collective wisdom of the audience. But if there is one thing that I would offer is just put your thinking about the patient and the value to the patient provider and the payer first before you start thinking about technology, market access, development or anything like that. If you do that, you will end up with the right spec and you'll find the right technological solutions to those specs. And then you have, almost clear and clean pathway towards the approval and commercialization. If you cannot do it, then figure out a way of solving for it. Talk to the clinicians, talk to the patients, spend time in actually understanding the market and operating in it. The other thing is a lot of the early startups are driven by the people who have very strong technical expertise. They know how to do stuff, and that's where those ideas come from. A lot of those people are smart enough that they can continue to navigate company through the future steps of the development and commercialization. But a lot of them, unfortunately, are either not appropriately equipped to do it or don't have interest in doing it. And what you don't want to have is a situation when the inventor runs the development without proper expertise in this area, or the developer is trying to commercialize without having. So I think that if you want to see your technology making it to the bedside, sometimes it helps to have humility to decide when it is actually right to step down or take a different role and bring the right expertise so that you can succeed through those periods of life cycle of development or commercialization. That's the only other thing that I would say, because you don't want yourself to become an obstacle to the success of your baby. So that's about it.
Fantastic. Where can people follow you or get in touch?
So we are obviously on the web, outcomecapital.com. I have a LinkedIn page. So, if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, that's always great. And I would also point out that I'm not the only person at Outcome. We have a very strong team with a very impressive expertise, and we share that expertise. We actually have a pretty extensive list of publications in terms of the methodology, market dynamics, and so on. So I would encourage you to explore those on our website and also subscribe to the newsletter. We do updates on a monthly basis on the market dynamics, solid state transaction, our expertise. Those are the areas, and happy to share those as the footnotes to this podcast.
Well, thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe, review, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. You can find Stan Glezer at www.outcomecapital.com and on LinkedIn. Thank you very much. Catch you on the next episode.
Thank you. Appreciate it.